Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Bob Bordone, and I arrived here yesterday from Boston. For the past 2 decades, I have taught negotiation, mediation, and dispute resolution at Harvard Law School, where I'm currently a senior fellow, and also have a independent consulting training practice in negotiation. The topic today is on negotiation, and particularly on some of the habits or behaviors that negotiators, even very fine negotiators, make that prevent them from being as effective or really attain their goals as they might be able to do. So I call this common habits of the merely effective negotiator. I want to start by offering a definition for negotiation. So I define it as any communication. So written, spoken, verbal, nonverbal, any communication between 2 or more persons with an intention to influence or to persuade. And so using this definition, I want to posit to all of you today that negotiations are pervasive in every aspect of your life. Sometimes I think many of us have a very stylized idea of what negotiation is. We think it is what happens, for example, maybe between the leaders of the United States and the leader of North Korea. Or maybe it's this thing that happens between union and management. Or maybe every so often when you get a new job and you're trying to negotiate for your salary. And all of those things are very much negotiations. It's also the case that every time you try to influence the choice of anybody, you are negotiating. So even babies negotiate. Because babies typically, after the first few months of their life, they're crying, and the crying actually has an intentionality. Like to a parent or guardian, it's to pick me up, or feed me, or give me attention, or change my diaper. So what I want to suggest to you first is wherever you sit professionally, whether in law or in business, whether in politics or in government or in any kind of nonprofit, if you are ever involved in a situation where you're trying to resolve a dispute in some way, if you are ever working with a group of people where you're trying to engage in some kind of joint decision making, if you are ever in a situation where you are making a deal, whether it is buying a car or starting a new company or signing a really big merger and acquisition, you are negotiating. In fact, negotiation is a really central leadership skill, business skill, management skill. We do it all every day. I have another colleague who teaches at the Harvard Business School who has a slightly different definition of negotiation. And one that I quite like. His name is Jim Sabanius, and he defines negotiation as the art of letting the other side have your way. And this is such a really wonderful way to think about negotiation. Because in fact, the most skillful negotiators are people who put themselves in the shoes of the person with whom they're negotiating, the person that they're trying to influence. And they say, how do I give that person a choice that is attractive for them, that is easy for them to say yes to? So one way I can negotiate is I can use my leverage to kind of force them to say yes. But a much more effective way to negotiate is to actually put myself in their shoes and think about, if I were sitting in their shoes, what would make it an easy yes for me? There's a story of a seminary, and a young seminarian goes up to the friar in charge, and he says to this friar, he says, "Father Superior, may I smoke while I pray?" And what do you think the answer to that question is? May I smoke while I pray? No, you may not, right? Ridiculous question. No, you may not. So 10 minutes later, another young seminarian goes up to the friar in charge, and he says, "Father Superior, may I pray while I smoke? And what do you think the answer to that question is, right? It's a very easy, of course, my son, right? And the difference is, how do you think about, if you were the decision maker, how would I frame this question in a way that they actually want to say yes, right? Or a dispute that if you were not involved in it, if you were just analyzing it from a third-party perspective in an analytical way, you could say, okay, this should be resolved relatively efficiently, without a lot of rancor. But what happens is, in fact, it gets protracted. What ends up also happening is relationships are damaged, money and time are wasted. I've spent much of my time over the past 10 years doing work with Israeli and Palestinian young leaders. And as somebody who is not personally involved in that conflict, but who studies negotiation and conflict, it's relatively easy to come up with any number of substantive outcomes where both sides will be made better off than persistent and ongoing conflict. And yet, as we know, this is a conflict that has escalated and gotten worse over the past 50 years. And so there's this question of, why does that happen? Regrettably, I suspect that many of you know of at least one couple who have gone through a really contentious and protracted divorce. And if you were not a member of that couple, if you were just looking on from a third-party perspective, it's often the case that you can say, okay, this is unfortunate that this is happening, but boy, have these parties made it much worse. Spending a lot of time and money, perhaps on lawyers, putting their kids and themselves through a lot of emotional turmoil. And so again, we have to ask the question, why does that happen? And I want to suggest a few reasons. And the first one I want to suggest starts very much with ourselves. So I'm going to presume that, and I think this is accurate, that I am in a room of talented leaders who are charismatic and very interpersonally skilled. And I'm going to share some bad news with you all, because one of the reasons why negotiations don't go as well as they could relates to the limits of our awareness on the impact of our behavior on others. So that is to say that even the most interpersonally skilled, the most likable, the most charismatic person in this room of what I am sure are very charismatic people has some aspects of their behavioral repertoire that they do on a pretty regular basis that, quite frankly, drive other people absolutely up the wall. And you know what? We don't get feedback about that. And here's the reason why. If I've been in a negotiation with some counterpart for 3 months, and then we suddenly reach a deal, it is unlikely that that counterpart is going to say to me afterwards, hey, Bob, can I just tell you the 3 things you kept doing that were totally annoying to me? Right? And they're not going to do that because it's rude. But then, not because I'm trying to be a jerk or trying to be difficult, but because I don't have the benefit of that information, I'm going to begin a negotiation with someone else and do the same exact thing. Some of you may have seen artists' renditions of what Martians might look like. And sometimes they have tentacles and they have eyes at the end of their tentacles. Is that familiar to anybody here? A few nods. Yeah, okay. Some of you are like, what is he talking about? Right? So what I mean is something like this. Okay. This is an incredibly helpful adaptive feature. Why? Well, those eyes can turn in and they can observe themselves, right? But our eyes, regrettably, are locked into our head. And we don't have the benefit of that kind of feedback. So that's one reason why negotiations don't go as well as they could. Second reason that is really challenging relates to institutional and cultural norms. So what I mean by that is every profession and then every organization has a set of expectations about how we do things here that can sometimes very consciously and sometimes subconsciously or implicitly affect how it is we negotiate, what we see as possible in our decision making. So, as I mentioned earlier, for more than 2 decades, I spent a lot of time teaching law students. And in the United States, the mindset of especially lawyers is very adversarial, very zero-sum, zealous advocacy. And that mindset can powerfully influence how people make decisions and what they see as possible at the negotiation table. Some years ago, Lee Ross, who's a professor at Stanford University in the psychology department, wanted to test just how powerful these institutional and cultural norms are. And so he took a very simple game. In this game, there were 2 sides, and parties had to make a simultaneous decision to either cooperate with each other or to not cooperate, to defect. And the way this game worked is if both sides cooperated, both sides did very well. They got a good number of points. If one side cooperated and the other side defected, the side that defected did very well. It got a huge number of points. And the side that cooperated didn't do very well. And if both sides defected, both sides did poorly. And this is shown in a little payoff matrix. Remember, the decision is simultaneous, so you don't know what choice the other side is going to make. And in the first set of experiments, Professor Ross tells the participants, you're going to make this decision to either cooperate or defect. You want to make the decision that's going to maximize your income. Oh, and by the way, the name of the game we're going to play today is called the community game. And then he collects the results from hundreds of participants. In the second condition, he took the same game with the same choice, with the same goal, with the same payoff structure. Okay, so everything about this game is exactly the same. But in the second condition, he said the name of the game we're going to play today is called the Wall Street game. Okay, so you have community game, Wall Street game. Guess what happened? The level of defection in the Wall Street game ends up being 3 times higher than in the community game. Right? And to be clear, whatever the right answer was, it should be the same for both games. These were incredibly, presumably talented people involved in the experiment, mostly graduate students at Stanford. The goal and structure of the game and the analysis was the same. But what's going on is people are saying, oh, it's a community. We should be nice. Wall Street, competitive. Right? The mere name is influencing the decision making because it's not the analytics, it's not the goal, it's not the payoff structure. And this is a powerful reason why negotiations don't go as well as they could. And then, right, the last reason, and this is where we're going to spend much of our time here in terms of why negotiations fail, is that we as human beings are hardwired to make a series of predictable errors or mistakes when it comes to negotiation. And I want to suggest that those mistakes occur broadly in 2 buckets, 2 kinds. One are strategic and analytic mistakes. So mistakes we make about how to prepare for negotiation, how to understand what our goals should be in negotiation, what the very structure of negotiation is. And then the second kind of error are more around psychological and social errors. So heuristics and cognitive biases in the way that we as human beings process information and experience feelings of gain and loss. And I want to be clear about the cooperation, because the cooperation is not meant to be misheard as an act of generosity, an act of kindness, an act of sweetness, none of which, by the way, I'm opposed to. I just want to be clear, that's not what we're talking about. It's an act of self-interest. Because if I can get the other side to get it and both of us cooperate, I'll do better for myself. Who cares about them? I'll do better for myself. So if you think negotiation is zero sum, then your strategy is going to be to claim as much value for yourself as you can. But if you think, as is the actual case, that a negotiation has some opportunities for us to create value, that is to expand the size of the negotiation pie we're dividing, then my strategy is going to be really different, because I'm going to want to foster an environment that actually supports mutual value creation. And what we know is that most negotiators, the reason why they don't do as well as they could, they don't even know what negotiation's about. They think negotiation is simply about dividing a fixed pie. So in negotiation, we have this concept of positions versus interests. And one of the things we talk about is the importance of negotiating based not on positions, but on interests. And the question is, well, what is the difference between them? Well, a position is what someone says they want in a negotiation. Here's my offer, here's my demand, here's my position. But that offer or demand or position is driven by some underlying interest, some underlying need, concern, goal, or fear that's driving it. And in negotiation, the way I create value is from pushing from positions to interests. So we're going to do another little exercise here. Like, for example, who gets the orange, or whether we sell in year 1 or year 5. When we get at interest, it's actually more than one issue. It's usually multiple issues. And as soon as it's multiple issues, I have some opportunities to create value. As soon as I have the possibility of an ongoing relationship, I have an opportunity to create value. Most of the negotiations in which we are involved, personally and professionally, have these hallmarks, even if we think it's just a single issue, like who pays what. Only a very, very few set of negotiations are truly one issue, where there's no ongoing relationship, where there's no reputational impact, and where a positional approach would make any sense. Okay, so let's imagine, for our purposes, that I have somehow persuaded you that an interest-based negotiation is the way to go. I now want to move to the next error that sometimes people make, because sometimes people say, yes, Bob, I agree. Shared interests are very important. In fact, shared interests are a major, if not the main source of value in negotiation. Okay, I could see that my little trick has worked, because some of you were looking at me, but now you're all looking at this adorable dog, which is my trick. So this adorable dog is my now 2-year-old, but then 2-month-old puppy, Rosie. So Rosie is an example that I hope will show you how the assumption around shared interests about being the main source of value is actually wrong, because it's actually the case that shared interests between the parties are one source of value, but differences between the parties are a much bigger source of value. So it turns out that 2 springs ago, I really wanted to get a puppy, and in fact identified a breeder who had some beautiful puppies, including this dog. The one challenge, if any of you have had a dog, especially when they're a puppy, is their ability to hold and not go to the bathroom when they're that little lasts for about 2 hours. And I was teaching a course at Harvard Law School that met in the afternoon for a 4.5-hour slot. So my interest was in getting some coverage for the dog in the afternoon. The child that you see in the other picture is not my son. It is actually my next door neighbor's son. And I learned that his parents very, very much wanted him to learn some responsibility. Not one of my interests, by the way, but one of their interests. And that they were particularly concerned with what he did in the afternoon after school. Also not a shared interest of mine. But those different interests created an opportunity. Because he could get responsibility during the afternoons by watching my dog, which is exactly when I needed coverage. And in fact, those two became best friends. I had the coverage that I needed, and the parents were extremely happy. Right? So when we're thinking about creating value in negotiation, of course I want to look to shared interests, but I want to look to differences as well. Differences in resources and capabilities between the parties, in relative valuations, in forecasts about the future, in risk or time preferences. We know from research that about 80% of negotiators, when asked what is their strategy in a negotiation, say, my strategy is to wait and see what the other side does, and then respond in kind. If that is true, if that research is right, what it means is your most powerful moment in a negotiation is your first move. And yet most of us begin a negotiation with the idea that I've done my due diligence, I've been very thorough, I'm objective and wise, and I have it right and you have it wrong. And I want to suggest that that is a very dangerous way to begin any negotiation, and even more so when it's a conflict situation. And the reason why is because we are, in fact, as human beings, hardwired to be overconfident and self-serving. This is not because we are evil or bad. I'm not saying there aren't evil and bad people in the world. I'm just saying that even people who are trying to be objective and fair actually suffer from overconfidence bias and self-serving bias. But in negotiation, this actually leads to increased levels of impasse. Both of us double down on our viewpoint. We think we've been fair, so when we hear the other side representing something, we think that now they're not trustworthy. So now both sides also feel that the other side is being unfair. Now that's actual research. This is a pop poll done some years ago, actually many years ago, done by a magazine called U.S. News and World Report. So the magazine asked people involved in the poll this question: who is likely to get into heaven? This is done in, I believe, 2000. And Bill Clinton gets 52%. Now, my guess is that he had a resurgence since then, although more recently may have fallen back to 52%. Some of you may have heard of Michael Jordan. He gets 62%, did better than Bill Clinton. Mother Teresa, she gets 79%. I have always wanted to interview the 21% of people who did not think Mother Teresa was going to heaven. But here's the best part of the poll. 87% of the people said, I'm going to heaven. I'm going to heaven. This is kind of interesting, right? More likely than Mother Teresa. Here's another self-serving bias in action. Why do we have these partisan perceptions and these self-serving biases? Is it because we are bad people who are trying to be manipulative? That's possible, but that's not the main reason why. I think there's a number of reasons why we suffer from partisan perceptions. We don't always have access to the same data. we have access to different data. Sometimes we have partisan perceptions because we don't have access to the same data. Sometimes we have partisan perceptions because we have access to the same data for sure, but we pay attention to different data. But here's the thing, right? As human beings, it's impossible to notice everything going on in a room at the same time. And so what happens is we're paying attention to data that confirms our existing perceptions and experiences, and we tend to ignore or dismiss disconfirming data. And yet, there's this really bad, like, this must be the worst advice that people give in negotiation, and it's from people who don't know anything about negotiation, which is, we should stay rational and not let emotions get in the way of good decision making. This is the most impractical and wrong-headed advice that one could give in negotiation. Because, okay, I haven't been in Korea for so long. This is my second time here. So I'm going to have to speak from the short amount of time I've been in Korea and then the rest of my life experience everywhere else I've ever been to. But I have never gone into any workplace, any school, any NGO, any government office, any church, mosque, or synagogue where on the way in there was a little box that said, please deposit your feelings here for pickup later today. And then you could, like, on your way out, pick them up and share them with your spouse. That's actually not how human beings work. We bring our feelings into our workplaces and our houses of worship and our government centers, and therefore, we should see them as tools to help us in decision making. We should understand that there are times when if we discuss them explicitly, they're actually part of the problem and therefore part of the solution. And if we ignore them, we will get stuck. Many times, I think people have this weird idea. They're in a conflict, they're in a negotiation, and they can tell that the other side is feeling emotional about it. And so what they do, because they're wise, talented problem solvers, is they come up with a solution. Here's what you need to do. I have an idea. Do this, this, and this. And it doesn't go very well. Like, the person blows up, it gets ignored. And the problem here is not that it's not a helpful solution. The problem is the other party's not ready for that. What they need first is this acknowledge emotion piece, which doesn't mean agree with the emotion, which doesn't mean we're going to sit in our emotions forever. It means we want to just acknowledge that it's there, because then that opens up the space for problem solving. And it's a real thing that I've learned in my work as a mediator, that the solution never comes from the mediator. The solution is within the parties, especially when there's a lot of emotion. And your job is to help them kind of acknowledge that emotion, and then move past it so that they actually can solve their problems. So there's lots of times when expressing emotion actually makes a lot of sense, because it could help mend relationships. It could help identify a source of the problem. We're certainly not saying you should express emotions to vent or just to make yourself feel better or to scare the other person. So last thing I want to talk about is this common assumption that if in a negotiation you're angry, hurt, upset, ignored, that the other side intended to do that, but that if they're angry, upset, hurt, or ignored, all that matters is that you didn't mean it and that you had good intentions. And a much more helpful set of assumptions to have in negotiation is that one's actions or inactions don't equal intentions. And even when your intentions are good, the impact on the other side can be not so good. So there's this really interesting dynamic that we tend to assume intentionality based on the impact of the other's behavior on us. So for example, if the other's behavior on us makes us feel hurt, angry, upset in some way, then they meant it. But it doesn't work in the opposite, and that's what's kind of interesting. So when they, in some way, are hurt, angry, upset, we tend to think, not so bad. You're overreacting. Calm down. Take a chill pill. And this is not helpful. It's a dynamic that is called the accuser bias, which was developed by Keith Allred, or studied by Keith Allred, who used to be at Harvard's Kennedy School. This bias that we have, that if I do some behavior that maybe is experienced by my friend Cynthia as harmful, she is overly prone to assume that I meant it. And once she assumes that intentionality, she becomes angry. And it is the anger that causes in her a retaliatory move. I then suffer from something called the excuser bias, right? Which is, you're overreacting, I didn't mean anything. But I also suffer from the accuser bias, you certainly meant that, right? And so then what I do is also get angry and counter-retaliate, and this results in a conflict spiral. And so what we want to be doing as much as we can is separating intentions from impact. So with respect to my actions or inactions, I could be very aware of my intentions, but what I am unaware of unless they ask is what the impact I'm having is on the other person. And similarly, with respect to the actions of the other, I know their impact on me very well. What I don't have a good sense of is what they intended, and so I need to ask.
The World Knowledge Forum